You can sometimes see in the media and pop culture the idea that the world is in grave danger due to overpopulation. With the last 200 years being unprecedented for human population numbers, it's almost become a macabre taboo topic, one which leads us to talk about humanity in a frankly inhumane way. However, this has been a topic talked about since the late 18th century, and it starts with the economist Thomas Malthus. Late 18th century England, where Malthus grew up, was a place of rapid change. We now know this as the First Industrial Revolution, which ultimately led to immense growth and prosperity for humanity. But at this time, this wasn't certain. Malthus saw his world and akined it to the rest of human history up to that time. The basic tenet of his model was that populations increase exponentially, but food resources only linearly. This leads to a point in which population numbers exceed carrying capacity that the Earth provides, and at this point a natural disaster must occur to lower the population again. This could be war, famine, or disease. This point is called the Malthusian trap. This sort of cycle is what Malthus called the cycle of misery. Malthus calculated that with infinite resources, the population could double every 25 years. Yet for the last 10,000 years, up until this time, the global population sat at under 1 billion. This is, Malthus posited, because of the cycle of misery. And indeed, modern economists like Oded Galler have found that the Malthusian cycle can explain pre-industrial societies pretty well. Take, for instance, Europe in the 14th century, which was the most populated time in medieval history. However, real wages were also very low, which can illustrate the lack of resources distributed among the population. The century was hit by the disasters that Malthus described, such as the Hundred Years' War, the Great Famine of 1315 to 1317, and the Black Death. The population steadily fell, yet wages rose. Pre-industrial economies were defined by this double spiral of wealth and population, never rising simultaneously. Malthus even analogized human populations to that of rabbits, and biologists like Charles Darwin picked up on Malthusianism to study animal populations. Today, Malthusian concepts like carrying capacity are a regular part of ecology. Malthus posited that another way to avoid the Malthusian trap was through controlling birth rates, for example through eugenics or by moving marriage to a later time in life. Many people had followed his advice, including policymakers, and the epitome of this was perhaps the Irish potato famine. Up until 1845, the population of Ireland was rapidly increasing, jumping to 6 million people. During that time, Irish farmers were also becoming increasingly reliant on a single culture of crop, the Irish lumper. When disease spread throughout the potato fields, a great famine hit the island, causing millions of Irish to die or immigrate. Today, 150 years later, the population of Ireland is still lower than it was before the famine. So was Malthus right? Charles Trevelyan, a British civil servant, believed so. Ireland at the time had no autonomous government and was controlled by the British Empire. Trevelyan was responsible for organizing relief to Ireland, but, influenced by his education in Malthusian thought, he took an inactive approach to the crisis. He believed that it was God punishing the Irish people for their moral indecency, referring to having high population growth in the first place. So, the government did nothing. However, certain thinkers of the time questioned the support of this crisis for the Malthusian model. Britain itself experienced similar population growth to Ireland, yet no crisis occurred. This could have been because Ireland, unlike Britain, relied on only one type of crop, making the threat of disease more likely. Furthermore, the use of only one type of crop was partially caused by government economic policy. Mercantilism, the economic policy that a nation should try to control as much of the world's resources and trade as possible, prevented Ireland from trading with foreign nations and obtaining new types of crops. All this together makes the Irish potato famine seem more preventable and less inevitable than Malthusians previously thought. So clearly, unlike Ireland, Britain was able to quote-unquote escape the Malthusian trap and continue population growth into the 19th century. For the first time in history, median wealth rose with it too. Why did this happen? Malthus largely ignored the advancements of technology in his time. This made him miss the fact that the mechanization of agriculture was drastically raising the carrying capacity of the earth. The use of new agricultural technologies made the proportion of people working in the farming industry fall. Many of these people would end up in the cities working in some of the world's very first industrial factories. So why was Malthus so pessimistic? He lived during the very early stages of the Industrial Revolution, which in his eyes did nothing to improve the lives of a growing population. Britain was the center of many agricultural technologies because of the Enclosure Act. During the Middle Ages, most of Europe had no conception of private property. Land was simply the common land, the property of God, which all peasants could use to graze cattle or start a garden or what have you. This meant that if you wanted to invest in a larger commercial farm, it might be too risky because someone could simply bring their cattle and trample it. So for centuries there was little agricultural innovation and most people had to work in farming for themselves. The Enclosure Act changed this. Now the King of England could give private individuals full right to plots of land. These individuals fenced in their lands, keeping commoners out. What Malthus saw was commoners losing the same land which they've used to sustain themselves for centuries, being forced to move into the cities as beggars, some of them even resorting to crime. To Malthus, this must have been yet another inevitable result to rising populations. More people leading to greater competition for resources, and importantly, more losers. Malthus couldn't have imagined the positive effects of this. Now that private individuals could securely invest in their lands, that's just what they did. Modified seed plows were imported from China, selective breeding took a more empirical approach, and entire acres of marsh were drained for farming. The result was that the earth, at least in Britain, could supply many more people. Eventually, the earth would support many times more people than the billion that it had kept for millennia. 20th century technologies like the nitrogen fertilizer would take billions out of starvation. Education also became much more widespread, especially between the 19th and 20th centuries. In Britain, a new class of industrialist entrepreneurs increasingly needed more educated workers to act as managers in the factory. They didn't want to pay for on-the-job training, so the industrialists lobbied for the British government to create public education. With the spread of education to the masses, women eventually entered the workforce and started to plan their own career goals over having children. The world had the highest population growth rate in 1962, and since then it has continued to fall. Yet despite this, the fear of overpopulation is still in the public mind. The book The Population Bomb, which predicted overpopulation would cause worldwide famine into the 1970s and 1980s, was written in 1968, 6 years after global growth rate hit its peak. China in 1980 created the one-child policy to curb population growth from similar fears. Yet today, China has a lower growth rate than the United States, and it's planning to replace it with a three-child policy. Countries like Russia and Japan are in even worse position, which are heading toward having more retirees than working people. Yet there is still fear of overpopulation. It's fitting that Malthus's model later influenced ecology, because the rise of the human species has led to what some scientists call the sixth mass extinction event of Earth's history. Species go extinct faster than we can discover them, and many diverse ecosystems are suffering as pigs and chickens outpopulate even humans. We may crowd around into ever tighter cities, but more and more wilderness is replaced with farmland to feed what seems to be our ever-growing consumption. An average American today uses up more resources than anyone did before the Industrial Revolution, and that shows not just in the food that we eat, but also in the energy that we use, from power plants and infrastructure to transport it all. The result of potential biodiversity collapse is a looming yet eerily distant threat. Many of us have thought, especially since the Industrial Revolution, that we are somehow removed from nature. When the first nuclear bomb was tested in New Mexico, Oppenheimer, one of the scientists in the project, said, "I am become death, the destroyer of worlds." He was quoting Vishnu, a god of the Hindu religion. Maybe Oppenheimer did feel that day that humans crossed a new plane. But eventually, he and his contemporaries weren't sure of whether we should have built the thing, and some are even beginning to regret it. Maybe what began in a mediocre island off the coast of Europe, what we now call the Industrial Revolution, was something similar. Maybe for a moment we do feel like gods. Oppenheimer quoted the Bhagavad Gita, a story where Vishnu tells a warrior that he must fight, even though he doesn't want to. Vishnu tells the warrior that it's his duty to fight, as destined by the universe. Maybe it was silly to think of ourselves as controlling our own destiny, and the pessimisms of old thinkers are warranted. Or maybe we just need to keep fighting.